Bonjour à tous, bienvenue à cette conférence de presse et merci d'avoir bravé la tempête dehors pour être ici. Mon nom est Catherine Lévesque, je serai votre modératrice pour aujourd'hui. With us today we have some distinguished guests, Regional Chief Cindy Woodhouse, welcome, David Stearns, a legal counsel, as well as Ashley Brock for the removed child class lawsuit, as well as Ministers Hajdu and Miller. So we will be taking some opening remarks and then turning to questions. So the floor is yours. Thanks.
Well, good morning. I'd like to thank the Algonquin and Anishinaabe territory on whose lands we are gathering today. I'd also, first off, before we begin, my deepest condolences to the family of the late Linda Beardy. Linda was found yesterday, unfortunately, at the Brady landfill in Winnipeg. My community goes out to the people of Lake St. Martin and all women and First Nations women across this country who continue to experience high levels of violence and early deaths. And so my heart and my heart and my mind is with the people back home. I'd also, I'd also like to thank the elders for opening us up in a good way today, for praying for us, for leading us always. But I know that we're here to talk about compensation and the $23.3 billion that we had settled together yesterday, and I want to thank my counterparts here today. I want to also thank the Prime Minister, because I know that he had helped us get here. Many governments before, people before, for 17 years, this issue of compensating children harmed in the system has been football kicked down over and over and over again, and nobody wanted to deal with it. It's always been, there's been many people pushing it forward. I commend former National Chief Phil Fontaine and Dr. Cindy Blackstock for starting us off in a good way 17 years ago. And I know previously Perry Bellegarde, former National Chief, also tried to push this issue forward. And so I'm glad that we began negotiating in good faith, and thankfully that we're here today. I'd also like to thank many of the government officials who also tried to help us along, like with that Val Gideon, Michael Burton, Katie Telford, all these people who came together to make sure that this happened today. So I want to thank you for your work and your contribution to First Nations people. And I know that no amount of money will ever restore. It's a signal. It's a signal to these kids that that wrong has been done to them, and no amount of money will ever give them back their childhoods, and their disconnect from their families and their communities. But I'm glad that that this government didn't kick this down the road. I'm glad that we settled this in an amicable way rather than in a courtroom. And I think that that's the way that we have to be in this country, is to try and work together and to try and talk to each other at the table rather than in courtrooms. And so I guess a little bit about myself. My name is Cindy Woodhouse. I'm the chief for Manitoba for the Assembly of First Nations. And I also want to thank our leadership and our people back home. I'm from the Treaty 2 territory in a community called Penimutang First Nation. And Manitoba is the epicenter for child apprehension in Canada and perhaps around the globe. It's a big problem. And I think that we have a lot of work to still do. I know I'm glad that we are settling this compensation piece, but we do still have to reform the system. We have to work at that system. And I know that the chiefs will continue to do that. And we will continue to do that as First Nations people, to try and work together to find a different way for our children and our families. Yesterday, the chiefs in assembly at the Assembly of First Nations came together to support the representative plaintiffs and the revised settlement agreement on compensation for First Nations children and families. The Chiefs unanimously passed a resolution expressing their support for the revised compensation final settlement agreement, including the Assembly of First Nation to take the agreement through the next steps of the approval process. The resolution also calls on the Prime Minister to make a formal apology to the representative plaintiffs and the survivors of Canada's discrimination and those who have passed on to the spirit world. While an apology and compensation will not bring back our children or make up for the lost childhoods or connections to family and culture, we have heard from survivors that this will mark an important step on their healing journey. So I am personally calling upon Prime Minister Justin Trudeau to make a public apology to our First Nations people. The resolution also expresses support for the representative plaintiffs and directs the Assembly of First Nation to return to the Assembly to provide progress reports on compensation and seek direction when required. At the December Chiefs Assembly, we heard from Chiefs that there was more work to be done and make sure the compensation agreement doesn't leave any children or families behind. The Canadian Human Rights Tribunal also said that we had more work to do to satisfy their orders on compensation. So we came together with the Caring Society, and Canada met us back at the negotiating table, and we were able to get to the point by working together in real partnership for our children and our families. This final settlement agreement was reached after many months of hard work by the representative plaintiffs who are here today. Thank you for being here. And the negotiating teams to compensate First Nations individuals who experienced Canada's profound discrimination under the First Nations Jordan's Principle program and the First Nations Child and Family Services program. Together with the Caring Society, we were able to secure an additional $3.3 billion in compensation to address all of the areas of concern that the Canadian Human Rights Tribunal identified, bringing the total amount to over $23.3 billion. I think this is the largest in Canadian history, but it's a big issue. The revised agreement provides compensation for children and their caregivers who were removed and placed off reserve that was not funded by Indigenous Services Canada, as well as caregivers who had multiple children removed. We secured additional funding to pay interest on the compensation owed to some claimants. It also provides compensation to the estates of some individuals who have passed into the spirit world. We are proud to say that this revised agreement is the best possible for our children and families who have been so significantly impacted by Canada's discrimination. The Chiefs in Assembly shared their reactions and input on the details of the FSA yesterday. I'm happy to say the FSA was approved by way of resolution passed by the Chiefs in Assembly. They also reminded us that there is more work to be done on long-term reform to ensure that the discrimination that our children and families experienced is ended and never happens again. Our children and families have been waiting for far too long for compensation. I believe we finally have turned a corner to bring this wait to an end. First Nations children and families will receive long overdue acknowledgement of the harms that were inflicted upon them, allowing them to move forward on their healing journeys. We anticipate that compensation will be available later this year or early next year, depending on approval by the Canadian Human Rights Tribunal and the Federal Court. And we remain committed to getting compensation out to people as soon as possible. All of the details about who will be eligible for compensation are in the final settlement agreement. Eligibility for compensation is based on the Canadian Human Rights Tribunal orders on compensation and the Assembly of First Nations class action lawsuit. So what are the next steps? Well, now that the Chiefs have provided their acceptance of the final settlement agreement, we will take the agreement to the Canadian Human Rights Tribunal for approval this spring in 2023. Once the Canadian Human Rights Tribunal has endorsed this agreement, it will then be taken to the Federal Court of Canada for approval in late spring or early summer of 2023. Once all these approvals have been granted, the claims process will begin in late 2023 or early 2024, and funds will start to flow thereafter. So I want to thank you, and I want to thank you all, and I want to thank you, Minister Hajdu, Minister Miller, for working in good faith with First Nations people to get this to this historic settlement. But you know, our hearts and our prayers are with the families and the kids that are affected by this, because I know that it could be triggering but it signals that they have been wronged, and hopefully they can find some healing moving forward. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Regional Chief Woodhouse, for your heartfelt and thoughtful words. And I do want to say on a personal note, it's been a real pleasure to work with you. And I want to, you know, as we say, as you say, lift up your hands to the exceptional leadership you're providing. Lift up my hands to you. It is an honor to be doing this work, and it's an honor to be with you here today on the traditional and unceded territory of the Algonquin people. And I think it's really important that Regional Chief Woodhouse started her remarks with her own grief and her own horror at the news coming out of Winnipeg around the findings of the remains of Linda Mary Beardy. And, you know, the first job I did as an elected official was to help to launch the inquiry into missing and murdered Indigenous women. And I traveled across the country and sat with families as they poured out their grief and horror and shock about the many, many ways that their daughters and mothers and aunties and grandmothers had been, really there's no other word for it, but tortured and then oftentimes forgotten. It's just, you know, the continuation of the reality of living in a colonial and patriarchal culture where those two ways that we perceive Indigenous lives and bodies mean that we continue as a country to undermine their value, and that has to stop. And so I want to thank you for starting with that. Obviously, the Government of Canada has a huge role to play, and so do many other partners, and so do Canadians. And so it's a tragedy that we start with today as we talk about, really, in some ways, the roots of those tragedies. You know, there's no coincidence that Indigenous people face higher rates of violence, Indigenous women and girls face higher rates of violence, and it's connected to what we're here to talk about today, compensation for a discriminatory system that meant that children didn't get a fair chance. They didn't get a fair start, and they were, in many cases, ripped away from families, from mums and dads and aunties and community and language and culture and connection, and that can never be restored. We can heal, for sure, and I've been so inspired in the journeys that I've had with Indigenous peoples, especially in this last year and a half, by those stories of forgiveness and healing. In fact, it's inspired me to examine how I can forgive and heal people in my life, heal with people in my life. But it's never the same, is it, when something like that happens? And so it is a result of decades of discriminatory underfunding for First Nations children and family, and it led to innumerable hardships and suffering and pain and trauma and loss and grief, and I think we all know people in our lives who have struggled with the consequences of those kinds of decisions that governments have made year over year. We are here, though, through the hard work and dedication of Indigenous leaders. This is an Indigenous-led settlement. It is historic. Regional Chief is right. It is the largest in Canadian history, and it's been entirely pursued and designed by Indigenous voices. And I want to, obviously, besides thanking Regional Chief Woodhouse, thank the Counsel, David Stearns and Robert Kugler, for Mushroom and Trout, of course, Minister Miller, who I consider a fearless companion in the work that we do together to set this country on a more equitable course. And of course, Dr. Cindy Blackstock, who told me one time that I was her 16th or 17th minister. That's persistence. That's a person who is persistent, and I was going to use the word patient. She's impatient in her pursuit of justice, but patient enough to see this work through multiple governments and multiple ministers. I also admire the tremendous determination of the many people involved in this process. I want to acknowledge the support of the Chiefs in Assembly yesterday for their work to carry out an emergency resolution that fully endorses this agreement. And so, as you've heard, we've reached this agreement on a revised final settlement for compensation for First Nations children and families that have been so terribly harmed through the underfunding of the First Nations Child and Family Services Program and the federal government's narrow definition of Jordan's Principle. The revised agreement, as I said, isn't going to make people whole. No amount of money can make people whole, but it is an important piece of healing because it's an acknowledgement of the discrimination. It is a total of just over $23.34 billion at this point, and it includes First Nations children who were removed from their home and placed in care that was not funded by Indigenous Services Canada. These were the elements that were under dispute under the last settlement agreement. It includes caregivers of children who were impacted by the government's narrow definition of Jordan's Principle. And it includes the estates and parents and children who would have been eligible as one of the classes for compensation. Healing isn't easy or linear, and trauma lives on in our bodies and in our spirits and in our families. And so the agreement will also fund a comprehensive package of trauma-informed cultural and mental health supports that will be available to class members. It will include things like emotional and cultural health support workers, professional counseling, and a trauma and culturally informed support line. And given that a large proportion of the claimants will be children and youth, supports will be enhanced to meet their specific needs. This is a very important step. We still have a few more steps ahead of us. The parties will now return to the tribunal to seek confirmation that the proposed revised settlement fully satisfies the Canadian Human Rights Tribunal's compensation orders. And then the agreement will be brought to the federal court for approval. And then if those approvals are received, the settlement implementation will get underway. And the Government of Canada stands behind this agreement, and we will see it through. We also have to learn from these mistakes and not repeat them. And that's why the long-term reform of the programming to ensure this discrimination has to, we have to continue with the long-term reform of the programming to ensure the discrimination ends. Bill C-92 is part of that work, of course, and it asserts, reasserts, in fact, Indigenous rights for control of family and children's services. It will help. It provides adequate funding, tools, and supports to implement First Nations law that protects families and children. But together with the parties, we'll continue to work towards a reformed child and family services program within Indigenous services that's centered around what's best for First Nations children and families. Canada is committed to supporting communities and services as we do this reform work together. We have to do two things at once. We have to do the work properly while reforming the system. And today is a really important step. The losses, as I said, can't be undone, but healing and growth can happen, especially as we work together. Healthy children and families create healthy communities. And this work is something that I truly believe we're all responsible for, and something that we're all going to benefit from. So miigwech, thank you, merci. I think, finally, I'm looking forward to the end of needing to pay out for discrimination. I'm looking forward to the day where all governments at all levels ensure that everyone does have a fair chance to succeed, and that funding is equitable, and that we see an end to lawsuits because there is no need, because there is equity in all of our systems. And that's when we'll know that everyone truly does have a fair chance to succeed in this country. Thank you. Miigwech.
Mr. Fraser? Sorry, Mr. Stearns, I believe it's your turn to speak.
Yes, good morning. Thank you, Regional Chief Woodhouse, for those inspiring remarks. And thank you, Ministers Hajdu and Miller, for your principled and steadfast leadership on this file. I am joined today by my colleagues Robert Kugler in Montreal and Joelle Walker in Vancouver. And if I may be permitted, I'd like to say a few words about the settlement, what led up to it, and I'd like to acknowledge individually all of the courageous individuals who stepped forward and put their name forward and their stories forward in this lawsuit so that we could arrive at this historic moment. As has been mentioned, this historic settlement will pay approximately $2.35 billion in compensation to the following three groups of individuals. First Nations children who were living on reserve or in the Yukon and who were taken from their homes and placed in care at any time from April 1, 1991 to March 31, 2022. The second group are First Nations children in Canada, whether living on or off reserve, who were deprived of essential services or who experienced delays in receiving essential services from a government at any time from April 1, 1991 to November 2, 2017. Thirdly, the family caregivers of those children. This settlement will pay more compensation to more affected individuals than any other settlement in the history of Canada, and it is believed to be one of the largest anywhere in the world. It is important to note that all of the money in this settlement will go to the class members. The fees and costs of the settlement will be paid over and above this amount once determined. The enormity of this settlement reflects the sheer size and scope of the harm that was inflicted on the class members as a result of a discriminatory First Nations family and child welfare system. It is our sincere hope that this money will provide some comfort to each of the class members and help them with the process of rebuilding their lives. Now, I would like to say a word about the young man whose name is attached to this historic case, Xavier Mouchou. Xavier trusted us to tell his story in the hope that this lawsuit would help change a discriminatory system and provide financial support to the children and families who suffered under it. Xavier was born into the Anishinaabe Nation in Lac-Simon, Quebec. When he was 9 years old, he was removed from his family for reasons which were never explained to him and placed in foster care. From the age of 9 until 18, Xavier was transferred to 14 different homes. He lost his native Algonquin language, his culture, and his ties to the Lac-Simon community. At the age of 18, Xavier was forced to leave his foster family and fend for himself because Canada did not fund post-majority services for First Nations individuals. Xavier, nous sommes très fiers et très reconnaissants de toi. It was determined by the Canadian Human Rights Tribunal that the child welfare system that was behind the removal of Xavier and tens of thousands of First Nations youth like him was a system organized around discriminatory and racist views about First Nations family and youth. This discriminatory mentality resulted in an epidemic of Indigenous children in foster care. As found by the Truth and Reconciliation Commission, more Indigenous children were living in foster care at the time of its report than were in residential schools at their height. Another of the named plaintiffs I'd like to mention is Zach Trout. Zach is the father of the late Sine and Jacob Trout, who suffered from the devastating effects of Batten's disease. Because of discriminatory government policies in breach of what is now known as Jordan's Principle, Sine and Jacob were deprived of basic medical necessities during their short lives. For years, Zach and his wife Veronica were forced to reuse needles and feeding tubes because their provincial and federal governments couldn't agree on which one should pay for these basic necessities. Sine and Jacob, Zach and Veronica suffered for years under this cruel government policy because of their First Nation status. We also wish to recognize the courage and determination of all of the plaintiffs who stepped forward to bring this lawsuit. I would like to acknowledge each of these remarkable individuals by name and thank them for their courage and commitment to the advancement of this case. Jeremy and his brother Jonathan Miwazagi and their late mother Arena Bila. Ashley Dawn Bach. Karen Osacho. Melissa Walterson. Noah Buffalo Jackson and his steadfast and courageous parents, Carolyn Buffalo and Richard Jackson. We also wish to recognize the leadership and dedication of the leaders of the Assembly of First Nations, particularly Regional Chief Woodhouse, and the AFN's talented and committed staff and legal team. The AFN championed this cause from the beginning and fought hard for this historic settlement. We also wish to honor the determination and unwavering resolve of the First Nations Caring Society and its remarkable leader, Dr. Cindy Blackstock. Our goals in bringing this class action were twofold. First, to ensure that individuals who had suffered significant harm under the discriminatory child welfare system, those like Xavier Mouchou, receive far more in compensation than the maximum of $40,000 per individual that could have been and was awarded by the CHRT in its 2019 compensation decision. Second, to significantly expand the group of individuals entitled to receive compensation. The CHRT decision awards compensation back to 2006, whereas the class action and this settlement will allow for compensation going back to 1991, the year when the discriminatory on-reserve child welfare policy was implemented. With this historic settlement, those goals are achieved. Those who are the most affected by the discriminatory conduct will receive significantly more than $40,000 in compensation, and those who were removed from their homes or who were denied their rights to essential services going back to 1991 will be compensated. There are many details to be worked out before funds can be distributed to class members, but as the regional chief said, we are working tirelessly to ensure that this happens without delay. Over the next several months, together with the AFN, we will be consulting with experts in First Nations communities to ensure that the distribution of funds is carried out efficiently and in a manner that is culturally sensitive and that recognizes the youth and vulnerability of many members of the class. Once we've determined how the funds will be distributed, we will seek approval of the entire settlement and distribution plan by the federal court and begin to distribute money. Thank you for inviting me and my colleagues here to present at this historic moment.
Good morning. Okay. Good morning, bonjour. My name is Ashley Bach, and I'm from the Michigagamang First Nation in northwestern Ontario, Anishinaabe Nation territory. However, I didn't get to grow up in my community because I was apprehended into foster care at birth and then adopted out later on. To start, I'd like to thank the Algonquin Nation for hosting us on their territory, to the elders for their prayers, and all the parties involved here. Most are present right now here, and as well to every single supporter for their prayers, activism, and compassion that they've shown for all of us representative plaintiffs and class members. I'm a representative plaintiff for the removed child class in the class action. And I also want to take a moment to send condolences to the Beardy family in Winnipeg, as well as send condolences to Cat Lake First Nation, who have a funeral today for a youth who is 24 years old, who's from the child welfare system. I became a representative plaintiff because I don't want this to happen to other youth and families, and because I believe that compensation is a step towards enabling our healing of the harms that we've experienced and suffered. We know that missing, murdered Indigenous women, girls, and Two-Spirit people, youth suicide, and many of the other issues that our communities are facing right now are linked to our experiences of genocide and discrimination, including through the child welfare system and through the discriminatory denial and delay of services that should have been provided under Durden's principle. I'm actually wearing my Anishinaabe Legal Services Corporation medallion right now, in part because many of the people that they serve up north have been impacted by these discriminatory systems that have brought us here today. So I do really believe we have a right to grow up with our people, with our lands and languages, in our communities, with our families, in our nations, and to be proud of ourselves for who we are as First Nations people. And I'm hoping that this compensation will be one way that we can return to that, be able to return home, be able to learn our languages, even go to school and use to raise our families. And I know the other representative plaintiffs too, some of who are in the room right now, they became plaintiffs for these reasons too. And I'm so pleased that we've reached a final settlement agreement, and that yesterday the chiefs provided united support for this agreement, and that all the parties have come to this agreement together in a united way and in a good way. The resolution that the chiefs passed unanimously is in support of the final settlement agreement, and mandates the AFN to take that forward to the next steps of approvals. And as you've heard already, there's several steps to go with the Canadian Human Rights Tribunal as well as federal court. And that resolution too, it remembers and supports the representative plaintiffs as well as all survivors and victims of Canada's discrimination. And they call upon the Prime Minister to make a formal apology to us. This has been a really long and emotional process, and for me it feels like almost a sort of spiritual journey, and when I'm doing this work it feels like I'm in like a mode that's almost like ceremony, holding the stories of all the youth and all of the families and the parents and all the survivors and victims who have been impacted. It has been a really long road to get here, and the representative plaintiffs, we've been involved every step of the way, and we've been feeling this every step of the way, like since the very beginning and since before this started too. And it's definitely taken a toll on us, but also we're so happy to be here. And this definitely sets this agreement apart from other settlements. Being involved and being able to be present and to be a part of this and to help guide it was really important. We've worked with the negotiating teams to ensure that the revised final settlement agreement addresses the concerns that the Canadian Human Rights Tribunal had back in the fall. And our next goal is to ensure that this compensation will be available to all First Nations people who are class members and eligible to claim. We'll be able to reach that as soon as possible. And we will continue to provide input and advice on the implementation process. And I promise, like myself as a representative plaintiff, and I know the other reps too, like we're here and we're gonna be a part of that process, and we'll be continuing to advocate for our peoples. So, miigwech for letting me be here today.
Bonjour, hello, Kwe. Je pense qu'à peu près tout a été dit. Important toujours de se souvenir qu'on parle, oui, aujourd'hui de sommes historiques, même dans la perspective mondiale, mais on parle aussi de torts historiques et qui remontent jusqu'aux années 90. Et l'annonce, c'est clair, et la ministre Hajdu l'a souligné, qu'aucune somme d'argent peut réparer les torts et les préjudices subis par les familles des Premières Nations. Cependant, les injustices historiques nécessitent ce genre d'action. L'annonce d'aujourd'hui représente une part essentielle de la responsabilité du Canada à l'égard de ces préjudices qui ont été subis dans le passé, mais c'était aussi un élément pour s'assurer que cela ne se reproduise plus jamais. Essentially everything's been said, and the historic sums announced today are matched only by the harm, perhaps even surpassed by the harm that has occurred back to the 1990s. This has been a complex web of legal suits, politics, emotions, but most importantly, with children caught in the middle. And so while we're talking about a very significant breakthrough over the last week that's been the product of years of negotiation and perseverance with all the actors today that have worked together, this is also an important signal as how we can move forward in fixing what is still a broken system and will require the minds around this table, those that have been negotiating, to come to a just resolution, but also other actors, provincial, territorial, municipal, individuals, to fix a system that is still widely misunderstood by the general public and will require focus. And I think if there's anything to remember about this is I think Canadians have been ahead of us in their thinking and pushing us to do better by Indigenous peoples, but specifically children. And it's been up to the politicians to catch up and to realize that we need to do this in a different way. Lots of people have been mentioned. They all deserve their to be singled out. I won't do it again for the sake of brevity, but I think one additional person needs to be the work of one individual, in addition to all those that have been named, needs to be highlighted, and that is Murray Sinclair, who was instrumental in bringing a lot of very determined people that perhaps had their own views on things together in and around a room and clearing the air and creating that space for us to do things and to put our own individual egos aside and to get things done for the sake of children. I think his contribution needs to be highlighted today. I'll leave my observations at that and perhaps conclude the formal presentation on that note. Miigwech, thank you, merci.
Thank you very much. We'll now go to the question period. Just a reminder for the people on Zoom to use the raised hand function if ever to indicate that you have a question, and I'll unmute you. Juste un rappel pour les personnes sur Zoom, s'il vous plaît, d'utiliser la main levée en fait pour indiquer que vous avez une question et je vous passerai la parole. Mais on commence avec les gens dans la salle. We'll start with Olivia Stefanovic, CBC.
Thank you. Good morning. I have a question for the ministers in the room. This legal battle started 16 years ago. 8 years of this fight took place under your Liberal government. And I'm wondering if you have any regrets about this long, drawn-out process, and specifically if you wish that you paid the CHRT orders when they were issued, and if you wish that Cindy Blackstock was brought to the negotiating table at the beginning.
Well, maybe I can start, and I'll turn to Minister Miller as well, who's been doing this work for a little bit longer than me. I think I was clear in my comments that I think that we have a role as federal politicians to push for the end of discrimination in all forms of funding. And so do I wish that we could have settled earlier? Absolutely. In fact, I think it's cheaper for governments to settle early. The protracted long battles are expensive for everyone, and it delays justice. So in the terms of compensation for harms done, you know, absolutely. I think looking back for me, the best way to end disputes is through a negotiated solution and not protracted legal battles. And certainly that's the work that Minister Miller is doing and hopefully we'll speak about in terms of other issues. But for me, the larger question is, how do we get to a place where we are not being forced by courts to provide equity in funding for Indigenous peoples and for other marginalized groups? And that's the work that we all have to do as legislators, as decision makers, as cabinet ministers, and indeed as the Prime Minister. There are other litigations in front of courts related to discriminatory funding. And the question that I constantly challenge myself with is, how can I be the best advocate as the Minister of Indigenous Services for that equity? And that's how I do my work.
I have a lot of thoughts on that question, Olivia, and they're perhaps contradictory in nature looking back right now, because today is an important day that I think is important, just in terms of closure for children, is important to highlight. And you look back at all the missteps of a maturing government, and sure, at times you could probably express regret or, you know, not focus necessarily on some pure legal interpretations and advice you get from different corners, and you can imagine what corners that they are coming from. and I don't want to put words into Dr. Blackstock's mouth, but I don't think her greatest contribution is a CHRT victory. The CHRT was, and the action under the CHRT was one that was a symptom of something that Minister Hajdu just referred to, which is discrimination that had occurred all the way back to the 1990s. The decision itself had its limitations, which is perhaps used opportunistically for a judicial review, some legitimate criticism. But I think to go back to my thoughts on Dr. Blackstock's contribution is to get a government to focus on children and not the legalities that could arguably be disputable, or different venues of going to the Court of Appeals or going to the Supreme Court, but really getting a government to look at the harm that's been caused all the way back to the 1990s, and getting a lot of people around the table that would not have, in a highly adversarial atmosphere, and sorting this out once and for all. You know, the CHRT decision did in fact have its limitations. David Stearns referred to them quite clearly. When you start focusing on the children that had been harmed, and if you had quote unquote just paid out the money, we said this before, this could potentially create a scenario where the same children are going to 3 different venues to get some source of compensation that perhaps put together gives them some sort of closure, financial compensation, yes, but has the impact of re-traumatizing kids and some of the most younger categories of the population. So the first formal negotiations on this type of structure started in early 2021, leading up and going, in fact, through an electoral period. And the current iteration of this went before the Prime Minister and a number of us before we formed the cabinet in 2021 to put an offer with an impending deadline of appeal in front of the parties with a structure that was the form today that finally resulted in what we have before the Canadian public now. And it has evolved, but at all times it has required resolve from many parties that didn't have the habit of speaking together, with the stewardship of Murray Sinclair, but with a lot of good minds wanting to work together and to keep this out of court. And we didn't get it right the first time, but we kept the money on the table, and we went back to the drawing board and looked at what the court had said, despite the fact that it had clearly stated that this was a transformative way of doing things, and got a little more money to make sure that, you know, all the classes were properly compensated. So I wish it had gone faster. I think we all do, but I think the way in which this was done really is a turning point in the way we do business, particularly when we keep the focus not on our own particular secular interests, but really on those that are most vulnerable, and in this case, Indigenous children.
Thank you. And with the case of Linda Beardy, the Indigenous woman whose body was found in the Winnipeg dump, I'm wondering how much faith you have in the Winnipeg police to investigate this case, and if your government is going to fund a full search of this landfill.
So, Olivia, this is my understanding, having spoken to the mayor of Winnipeg yesterday, is that this was a relatively new find, and that it reflected some heightened vigilance at the dump by workers whose work should be highlighted in terms of you know, a vigilance that hadn't been in place before that. So it is an ongoing investigation. I do have faith in the Winnipeg Police and what they are doing. And given that this is an ongoing investigation, it is very, very difficult to comment in any further detail. But I would say that because this is a platform that I have, there is a hotline for anyone who has any information with respect to this case. And the number is 204-986-6508, or Crime Stoppers 204-786-8477. As to your second question, we currently have a feasibility study that's ongoing with respect to the Prairie Green landfill. We expect to have the results of that in a few weeks. I can't speak as to what those recommendations will be, or any other further searches of the Prairie Green landfill. I do understand there's a pause, though, and that's work that will have to be done with the City of Winnipeg and the province.
Just before we go to the next question, if we could keep the questions and the answers relatively short. We also have some people waiting online. So Stephanie Taylor, Canadian Press.
Hi there. Minister Miller, I just want to ask about that feasibility study that you referenced. The Assembly of Manitoba Chiefs, even though it says it's not done the feasibility study, is expressing a lot of confidence that a search of the Prairie Green landfill will be feasible. At this stage, without seeing the cost estimate or the technical details, can the federal government commit that it will fund at least part of any kind of future search that happens there?
It's hard to comment in full detail, Stephanie, at this time on what that will look like. We, as you know, we paid for the feasibility study. It was the right thing to do, and we've been there from the get-go. And I've told the mayor of Winnipeg that we'll certainly be there for the long haul. I think looking at the feasibility study, we'll have to look at what those recommendations are and then sit down with the families in particular, but all of those able to actually do a potential search if that is the decision to be made. I just don't want to get ahead of that decision-making process, but certainly the federal government's going to be there and play its part.
Turning back to the settlement, there's been calls from some, including Cindy Blackstock, obviously, that there more still would need to be done on the long-term reform side for the $20 billion. Is the federal, and question to the ministers, is the federal government prepared to provide funding for the long-term reform beyond the $20 billion that has been committed at this stage of the game?
I think the short answer is that we're prepared to see the long-term reform be concluded, essentially. And so I'm less focused on the ultimate cost of the long-term reform and getting to the goals of the long-term reform, which is to make sure that children don't fall through the cracks. And so as we work through those processes, obviously we have a number of experts helping us to figure out what that looks like and what the costs could be. And I'll remain open throughout the process to making sure that we have sufficient resources, financial resources, to achieve the goal. And the goal is a system that makes sure that kids are safe, protected, loved, and to the best of the ability of everyone kept with community and family.
Fraser Needham, APTN.
Thank you. So I guess I'll ask the question, is now, with this latest agreement, is it guaranteed that all children and families affected by it will receive a minimum of $40,000?
The short answer is yes. The minimum compensation is $40,000.
Okay, and my next question is perhaps maybe, and this is to the ministers that, or all of you, is that maybe approaching this as a final settlement agreement might be the error in the first place, that there is no final settlement agreement, that there's likely more children that have fallen through the cracks during this time period. It's trying to cover a lot of people, and there's a lot of children and families that were denied, and that by putting a hard cap on the amount, it's wasted probably 16 months of when you could be flowing money. So why not do something like this in stages, not have a hard cap, and start flowing the money immediately so the families can access it and children?
I think it was really important to reach a final settlement agreement that everybody agreed with before we began the process of compensation. And it was really important for, I think, the clarity for parties that the agreement was going to encompass everyone that the parties felt needed compensation. And I think, people worked really, really hard to get to a place where I think all parties agree this is satisfactory. And so now I think the process of designing the system to ensure people can access the compensation fairly, which, as you know, will be delivered by a third party, begins. And so we look forward to the next steps.
I won't go into the details of some of the litigation ins and outs, Fraser, but obviously people were contemplating numbers of ideas around the negotiation table, but I think you do have competing class actions to some extent, some overlap, confusion even caused by that. And so not that there wasn't concern for making sure that those that were the most severely affected by this underfunding and discrimination didn't get paid out on a priority basis. I think at the end of the day, with everyone around the table, everyone wanted to get a sense, and there was an opportunity for people to get some settlement that was comprehensive in nature, and their interest in all sorts of sides that it'd be unwise to go into detail about. But this isn't the day, I think, to renegotiate that and to question it. And this is the day, I think, to celebrate some really important work with people that have done and spend a lot of their waking hours making sure that children are properly compensated.
And maybe I'll just add one last thing, and that is that we're talking about compensation here for harms, but the Jordan's principle money continues to flow, and children are getting supports now. So although we're talking about compensation, and it's important that people are compensated, this hasn't stopped our work. And the work that we're doing now within the department, independent of the long-term system reform, to ensure that children get the services and the supports they need immediately.
We're now going to questions online. A reminder to use the raise hand function if ever you have a question. We'll start with David Aiken, Global News.
Thank you very much. I have a first question for Ashley. Ashley, thank you so much for being here, and must be a great weight to be speaking on behalf of so many people, and I'm so glad you're able to tell us a bit about your experience. And I wanted to ask about that as we come to the end of this process, or as we look to be near the end of it. I wonder if you can just reflect on what it means for you and for your family and for your friends. And then also just a second bit, why or what it will mean to have Canada apologize, the Prime Minister of Canada apologize for past harms. Could you help us with a bit of that?
Yeah, to start, I think for myself and for I know a lot of other youth too, especially who are under the removed child class, like receiving this compensation is a way, like some of us are young, like we're in our 20s, and some people even like 19 years old, and being able to receive compensation of $40,000, especially if you're transitioning out of a system that isn't necessarily supporting you, or that doesn't have like a social safety net in place for you, like of your family and your community, and various caregivers and service providers. Like having that sort of money is a way to ensure that you have a roof over your head. It's a way to ensure that you're gonna have food on the table. It's also a way to ensure that you'll be able to go to school and get an education and then get a good job, and like break those cycles of intergenerational trauma when you're having your own kids too, because there's also a lot of young parents who are impacted. So to me, like I think back when I was president of Youth in Care Canada, we held a gathering of First Nations Youth in Care advisors, and we asked them what would receiving compensation mean, and they a couple people said, well, one person said he would immediately put a down payment on a house. That's what he wanted to do. He was a couple years older, so he already had a family started, and he wanted to make sure that they had a place to live, because renting's hard, and especially it's hard like with housing availability, and also when you're like visibly Indigenous and experiencing discrimination. Another youth said he wanted to use it. He was a bit younger, and he had a really great career ahead of him in a competitive sport, and I'm trying not to identify him right now, but he wanted to use that money to be able to travel to competitions and to compete, and also to help his training and like secure that future for him, and also just do something that he loves and something that was helpful and like healing for him too. And I think that's also part of the reason why apology from the Prime Minister means so much. It signifies that Canada really truly does recognize and understand those harms that they perpetuated against us, and it starts like a moment in time where people can be like, okay, like this is where like what's been done to us and this harm that we've experienced, it's been acknowledged, and now we can start to heal, and I'm hopeful that apology will come soon.
Thank you very much. It's very helpful. And second question, quick follow-up for David. David Stearns, more processy question. In your remarks, you mentioned there's still some details to be worked out. Can you put a little color on what details means in this context? Is it administrative, or there's no really fundamental arguments among the parties about an issue, I'm assuming? So could you give us a little color on the details that still have to be worked out?
Right. I wouldn't call two of them detailed. One, they're both very important steps, and we're very, mindful of the significance of them. The first one is an application to the Canadian Human Rights Tribunal, and that will be to ensure the tribunal that its prior compensation order is going to be satisfied through this settlement. And secondly, an application to the federal court, which will be public on full notice to everyone. And that is a test to ensure that the settlement is in the best interests of all the class members. And both of those are important stages. We're hoping, and the tribunal has been very swift in its handling of this case. We're hoping to get a hearing before the tribunal within the next month or two at the outside, and then to get to the federal court soon after that as possible. So those are the two major items that we're working on. And then process-wise, it's not a simple task to devise a process that will ensure the responsible distribution of these kinds of funds to a vulnerable population such as this. And so we're working with the administrator that has been appointed by the court to come up with processes and safeguards and assistants and navigators to help everybody navigate that process. So there will be more to come on that. And that process, once it's been finalized, will be submitted to the court for approval as well.
Thank you very much. Et on va terminer avec Anne-Louise Michel, Radio-Canada.
Bonjour, j'ai une question pour le ministre Miller, des questions qui ont déjà été abordées en anglais. Je voulais savoir quel a été, de quoi vous avez parlé avec le maire Scott Gillingham suite à l'annonce de la découverte du corps de Linda Birdie dans la décharge du chemin Brady à côté de Winnipeg.
De un, on a parlé évidemment du drame et de la découverte et de ce qu'on pouvait faire. D'abord, une mise à jour du service de police de Winnipeg, évidemment le maire ayant plus d'informations que moi. Donc, il m'a fait un petit sommaire de l'état des choses, des circonstances de la découverte et évidemment, sa surprise et son état est évidemment très secoué, comme nous tous, sur le fait que ce soit une personne supplémentaire. Déjà, on cherche 4 personnes. Mais je voulais, comme je l'ai fait quand il y a eu ces découvertes il y a 3-4 mois, je voulais lui assurer que le gouvernement fédéral sera là, le cas échéant, pour tout appui qui pourrait y avoir pour essayer d'avoir des réponses et donc d'avoir d'abord un canal de communication qui était ouvert pour qu'on puisse réagir rapidement. Ce qu'on sait de tout ceci, c'est que plus souvent que non, bien qu'on ait pu avoir des indications puis des plaidoyers de groupes autochtones de disparition, que ce soit la police, les autorités locales réagissent plus souvent que non de façon très lente. Et c'est malheureusement cette réalité auquel fait face presque toutes les communautés autochtones quand ils ont à appréhender le système de police. C'est une réaction qui est souvent très lente pour chercher les leurs. Et donc, aujourd'hui, évidemment, vu que c'est un cas actif, la police est en train de chercher. Et je voulais m'assurer d'abord et avant tout qu'on puisse réagir plus vite qu'auparavant. Et c'est ce que m'a assuré le maire de Winnipeg. Et donc, c'était évidemment un appel très important, appel de courtoisie, oui, mais pour s'assurer qu'entre nous deux et même avec le gouvernement du Manitoba, il y avait toutes les ressources nécessaires pour appuyer une recherche qui est très active en ce moment.
Une rapide question de suivi. Vous parlez d'agir, le cas échéant. De quel type d'action on parle? Vous parliez tout à l'heure de l'étude de faisabilité des fouilles, notamment pour le dépotoir de Prairie Green. Mais ici, Linda Birdie a été trouvée dans le décharge du chemin Brady, ce qui n'est pas la même étude de faisabilité. De quel type d'action le gouvernement fédéral peut faire pour aider et le gouvernement provincial et la police de Winnipeg et la ville de Winnipeg à enrayer ces horreurs?
Vu évidemment, tout dépend des faits aussi. Hein. Vu que d'apparence, ce n'est pas un cas qui est lié directement aux autres découvertes. Évidemment, c'est une femme autochtone, difficile de ne pas dire directement parce qu'il y a des éléments sous-jacents qui sont très communs. Il y a des appuis en travaillant avec le service de police de Winnipeg. Ça se peut qu'ils n'ont pas besoin de l'appui du fédéral pour l'instant, évidemment, c'est un cas actif de police. Alors, il faut bien leur laisser la place. Là, il faut s'assurer qu'ils font leur travail, c'est clair. Mais dans la mesure où ils trouveraient d'autres éléments qui pointeraient à quelque chose de plus vaste, ce serait à discuter, surtout avec les familles. Il faut impliquer les familles concernées, la famille de Mademoiselle Birdie. Et ce sera à suivre. Alors donc, des appuis à la famille, des appuis, le cas échéant, pour une perquisition ou une fouille plus élargie. Ce sont tous des éléments qui seraient peut-être souhaitables, mais encore faut-il s'assurer que ceci est nécessaire ou désirable. Alors, c'est une discussion qui va évoluer, mais je voulais d'abord et avant tout assurer le maire de Winnipeg qu'il avait l'écoute et l'appui du fédéral.
Alors, ceci conclut la conférence de presse. This ends the press conference. Thank you very much for your time and for your comments today.